Welcome to Midnight in America, your source for the most provocative global affairs content on the internet. This week's guest is General Ike, host of the Building Jerusalem podcast, who joins us to discuss his upcoming U.S. Friendship Tour. It's Midnight in America, 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Sydney, Australia. General Ike, what time is it in Jerusalem?
I believe in Jerusalem right now it's 7 a.m., although I am currently doing my own show from Sydney as a you.
So you're not actually in Jerusalem. Why are you building Jerusalem from Sydney?
That's an interesting question. I think like the going into the podcast, the idea behind building Jerusalem was not that I'd always be in the physical city of Jerusalem, but I was very inspired by the poetry of William Blake. And his own rooting in the older prophetic works of this idea of Jerusalem as the heavenly city, the ideal society that we strive towards regardless of geography.
So most of us know William Blake as the author of The Lion and the Lamb. At least in the United States, we had to read that in high school as a required poem in our anthologies. But I don't know much more about William Blake. Can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I just I think that he wrote a lot of more, what would you say, conventionally accessible poetry, and then he also had these deep mystical visions that he struggled to sort of get onto the page over the course of many years, and his works are sort of what would you say, like a stepping stone between sort of the classical biblical and other prophetic works, and this sort of, a lot of modern poetry. So Ginsberg refers to him and draws on his work, and he seems to be very like placed within a sort of context in which the poet was sort of looking at his work as a natural successor to the work of the prophet, as described in biblical terms, and trying to make that connection.
Now, the prophet, when people say the prophet, often they mean the prophet Muhammad or the prophet, some other prophet. When you say the prophet, you have to explain for our listeners are going to be of all religions and all backgrounds. I mean, what do you mean by the prophet?
Well, for Blake, I think the prophet was he would specifically be drawing on the old prophets of the Jewish works and Christian works, obviously Jesus, but also like very substantially from Isaiah and Ezekiel, and he talks about a lot about the poetic soul being at the heart of the prophetic faith of Judaism and Christianity. And to him, what that sort of unknown beyond that moves the artist into creation is the same for what you would think of as the secular poet and what you would think of as the religious prophet, and all of them are moved from the great beyond into creative acts.
So he really sees
moral acts.
A convergence or an interweaving of the religious and the secular life.
Mm-hmm.
And is that what's behind building Jerusalem and your own work?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was like a long period when I was trying to figure out how high an ideal could I reasonably be moving towards. What sort of, like, how good could things get if they were going well? And I think that that sort of led me to look at foreign religious texts, and also the religious texts of my own upbringing with fresh eyes, because I think there's a stale dogmatism that's at the heart of a lot of what puts people off these works, and I think there's something very very beautiful and very elevating to be gleaned from the midst of it if we can get past the tawdriness.
Right. And how...
I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it sort of does. I mean, really, I guess where we need to get is... now, I'll put the link to your podcast in the comments section once this video is posted. But How does this relate to the podcast? I mean, what are you actually doing on the podcast?
I think the principal thing I'm trying to do on the podcast is go into genuine conversations with as far as I'm able, a real sense of humility, to go and meet with people who, in one way or another, are aiming themselves towards a better world, and in a very, very broad sense, and really trying to, through conversation, uncover what it is that they're able to communicate about those efforts, and then to allow myself and listeners to sort of draw from that stuff that will help us in our own personal efforts.
Right. And why, if you'll forgive me, I know it's maybe it's just a personal conceit, but why General Ike? What does that have to do with all of this? I assume that your real name is not Ike, and that you are not a general in any recognized armed forces.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. There. As far as I'm aware, I've never been made a general in any genuine armed forces. It's I don't know. It's a kind of stupid name, but I sort of. No, that's not fair. I was my teacher in Jerusalem actually recommended it to me. He was like, "Go for General Ike," and I said, "That's ridiculous, and it'll never fly, and also it sounds awful." And he was like, "No. It's very in keeping with American popular culture nicknames at the moment." And he gave some example. I think the fact that LeBron James is called King James. And I thought, well, he pushed at me for a while in that regard, and I thought I could see it from his point of view, and so I'm hoping that eventually everyone else can as well.
And I don't know if you want to reveal your legal name, but is Ike a possible nickname for your actual name, or is Ike just pulled out of the air?
No, it's very much a real nickname. I mean, my Hebrew name is Yitzchak. Right. Which is not easily pronounceable for a lot of people.
Which would be Isaac in English, for people who may not be aware.
Right, yes. Isaac in English. Yeah, and then I was actually at what was I doing? I think I was doing the Alexander technique of all things, and someone mentioned to me, have you ever been called Ike? And I thought, no, I haven't, and that's really interesting. And so I started playing with that, and I found that I liked it.
So there's no connection to President Eisenhower of the United States?
There is something of a connection in the sense that he was, especially for a figure of his, what would you say, conformity. He was very orthodox in a lot of ways. He was in the military and then in the presidency, two of the most conservative organizations. And from those positions, he encouraged citizens to really take something of a skeptical attitude towards their own systems, and I think that's something that I in many ways struggle to emulate, because I think that it's very easy to sort of throw stones at the walls of the academy from the outside, and it's very easy to grow docile from inside, and it's very tricky to sort of be. Got a bit of static background there.
I know that was me telling our listeners that they'll have a call-in opportunity soon. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, okay. Cool. No, so it's very hard to sort of play both those things at once. It's very difficult to be pushing the slow conservative society building agenda and also be constantly looking out for the more liberal opportunities to take a novel turn.
Right. Now, speaking of America, I know we're going to talk about your upcoming U.S. Friendship Tour, but I'm curious if you'd be willing to talk about your previous U.S. Friendship Tour, which I think many people listening might be just thrilled to hear about. Could you tell us a little bit about your last tour of America?
Yeah, sure. What was it? It was 2013, I want to say, in 2015. I'm not certain. I think 2013. And I just read The Great Gatsby,
Okay.
and the whole way through it, I was sort of, I was just kind of, I put myself through it in a sense because I knew that it was real literature, and the whole way through I was like, I'm not sure if I like it or if I don't. And then the last page, there's just this explicit coda that sort of hits you over a page in narration like a steam train, and it really sort of stirred up my spirit. I'd always had this fascination for America. I mean, I was born and grew up here in Australia. I always had this fascination for America, and that really sparked it again. And I wanted very much to.
You're straining my memory, but I think that last page was about the virtues of the Midwest. Is that about him going back to the Midwest? Nick going back to the Midwest? That's a part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
So it starts. On the last night with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at the huge incoherent failure of a house once more. At some point I committed the whole thing to memory. I could probably pull a good chunk of it out. But it's the narrator about to leave after all the hubbub has subsided, and just reflecting on how much Gatsby's dream was something chaotic and unreachable, and how that sort of that intense striving for that dream is always tragic and unachievable, but still really important in some ineffable way. It talks about the Dutch sailors first arriving in America, all of that.
And then that inspired you to do what?
Oh, so that inspired me to what was it? I flew across to New York, and then I hitchhiked from New York to Los Angeles. So
not a lot of Americans hitchhike these days. What was your experience of hitchhiking?
I learned that the hard way.
Of hitchhiking in America. How did people react to you? How did they treat you?
You see, it's when you say how people treated me, that's a tricky one, because I think a big part of it was like moving past the many people who weren't interested in picking up a hitchhiker. But I sort of discovered quite early that it wasn't really a done thing. Like I made it from, I think I walked across the George Washington Bridge from New York into New Jersey. Right. And I got a ride to a truck stop on the New Jersey Turnpike, and I figured hundreds of truckers going through this, easy to get a ride. And apparently, had I tried 30 years earlier, it would have been no problem.
Right.
But most truckers now belong to fleets rather than having their own rigs. And the rules of the fleet are, if you pick up a hitchhiker and we find out about it, you're fired.
Right.
So it was a lot harder than I expected.
Do you have any good stories? I mean, I'd love to take a few minutes. Just like I know you have some magnificent stories, but are there any, from that time that you'd like to share? That I think people would love to hear it. If you have any, you'd like to tell us about.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. What springs to mind is not so much the what would you say, the triumphs as the terrors. Like when you say that I'm instantly thinking of the times I almost got robbed and the times I most feared for my life. Which it's interesting. I suppose like in a way the most beautiful and the most terrifying moments both happened in the Rockies in Colorado. So it was at that point I think I was just starting to get into my swing and realizing that I'm probably going to make it. This is looking pretty good.
Continental Divide coming up and.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. It's very very encouraging, and so I was coming through the Rockies. Beautiful, by the way. The Colorado Rockies. I don't know how many listeners have it within their power to visit the Rockies and haven't yet, but I highly recommend it. I went as I was going through. I was I think I ended up getting dropped off in Glenwood Springs. And I had this rule so as to keep the sort of pioneer spirit sort of alive in me that I never paid for accommodation, so I didn't know where I was going to sleep. I didn't know. So if someone offered me a roof over my head, I could take it, but otherwise I wouldn't pay for one. I'd find somewhere else to sleep. So I was in Glenwood Springs, this little town in the Rockies, and I went up into the woods to find somewhere to lay out my sleeping bag, and I just lay out on the side of a mountain amongst the trees, and I was very tired. I was very ready to just fall asleep right there, just leaning against my backpack, and then it started to drizzle. So I took my backpack back on, and I went down the mountain, and I found this structure that I had seen on the way up, and tried to get some shelter. I didn't know it at the time, but I found out later that it was an abandoned quarry. So that was the vibe. Yeah.
So you're sleeping alone in an abandoned quarry. Okay, and where does this go?
Well, so where it goes is this: the abandoned quarry is it didn't really have walls, and so the rain was coming in at an angle. So even I was getting some shelter, but not complete shelter, and so I had this bivy sack, which is kind of like an extra sleeping bag made out of tarpaulin that you can get to sort of wear over your sleeping bag to protect you from rain. And so someone had given it to me a couple of states earlier, fantastically generous act. And so I put myself in my sleeping bag, and then I put myself in the bivy sack, and then I lay down to try and sleep. And as I'm lying there trying to sleep, with the wind coming in through the side of the knocked out walls, I hear the slow sound of footsteps on gravel.
And a chainsaw started.
Every instant. Yeah, well, this close to the chainsaw.
Yeah.
But what was really interesting about my predicament was that I sort of thought, all right, well, what I should do now is to sit up very quietly and watch very quietly, and you try and react according to my best guess of what's happening next.
Yeah.
But I sort of thought that it was possible that whoever this is doesn't mean well, and it's also possible that if this person doesn't mean well, they don't know I'm here, and it's very possible that if I sit up, given that I'm wrapped in tarpaulin, I'll make a lot of noise, and thus attract attention. And so maybe the safest thing for me to do is just not move. And so I was just lying there, completely ignorant as to my surroundings, just hearing these boots getting closer and closer. I think I pulled out my phone and whispered like some sort of last will and testament into my phone. I have to try and dig up somewhere. And then the boots came closer, and then the boots went further, and the disaster was averted, and I never found out who that was.
You're brushed with terror. All right. Well, hopefully your upcoming U.S. Friendship Tour will be much more comfortable than your first one. What's the plan? Tell us about it.
So it started off with a sort of just a flash of inspiration. I'm gonna close this window. I might get a better sound quality. There we go. It started off with a sort of flash of inspiration, much like with the first tour, which was just, I think a friend of mine mentioned to me Ken Casey's Further tour. Ken Casey and the Merry Pranksters, their tour across America in, I think, '64. And that was it, like, so I don't know if you're familiar with this tour, or if you're listening.
Tell us about it. Tell us about it.
So in 1964, Ken Casey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he got he was heading from, I think he was going the opposite direction. He was going from California to New York to attend, I think, the publication of one of his books. And he had this, he decided to get a group of people together to do it, and they went and bought an old school bus that had been gutted and fitted out with bunk beds, and they painted it psychedelic colors, and they schlepped across America in this bus, having wild adventures. And they were supposed to be filming a documentary, which I think only ended up being made in 2011. Tells you something about like the hippie work ethic right there. But it was apparently like it was one of those moments that kickstarted what we would later come to understand as the whole hippie movement, the countercultural movement. Casey himself was sort of this bridge between the beatniks and the hippies, and I think some of the people who later sort of traveled and played with him became the Grateful Dead, and it was just like one of these moments of cultural power, but also just wild adventure. And I sort of, as soon as I heard about that, I said, I want to do that. Right. And it really started with that, with just like that sort of personal desire to follow in his footsteps backwards, and to have a nice cross country adventure. But what happened was, as the idea sort of grew, it occurred to me that as I have my own podcast that I'm working on, that I could take that across the country with me and interview people all the way along. And along with that came this sense of I think that it seems like there's I don't know much about America. I'm an Australian, and like I'm not directly enmeshed, but it does seem like there's a lot that bits of America have to say to other bits of America that doesn't get said. It seems like there are two entirely separate conversations going on in America, and I figured that if I could go and just interview a whole bunch of people from both sides of that invisible wall, and try and see if I can understand them in a way that other people listening who don't usually hear them could also understand them, that maybe that could be some small step towards Americans talking to each other and away from Americans shooting at each other.
So,
which I don't know if it can or not. But it seems
I don't think we shoot at each other that much. But you're
not yet.
We do enjoy scaring foreigners in remote quarries, but we don't usually do that much shooting. But so this is not a U.S. friendship tour between Australia and the U.S. This is a U.S. friendship tour to bring Americans together. Is that your idea?
Well, look, to the extent that I'm an Australian and I'm quite friendly by disposition, it's an Australian-American friendship tour. But to the extent that it's, if I go there and I say I'm an Australian and I come in peace, I think that the reaction will be like, okay, that's good. Also, so what? Because we don't really have any particular beef. I think if I go interview someone at Harvard and say, what is, and try to hear what they're saying in a way that makes sense to the average Texan, and then go and talk to some Texans and try and see if I can hear what they're saying in a way that makes sense to New Yorkers, then that's actually something worthwhile. That's something difficult and pointed.
Right. I'm going to open the call-in line, and General, you can't see this on your screen, but people watching can see it. It's Skype line is Skype S Babones. There's a U.S. phone number on 412-567-6798, or an Australian phone number on 02-8003-6853. We'd love to hear from you. I'm going to leave those numbers up. Now, we're going to keep talking here. So if you're listening and you'd like to call in, don't feel like you don't want to be impolite and interrupt. We'd love to have you interrupt, but we're not going to sit here and just wait to see if someone calls. We will keep talking. But if you want to call, give us a call. We'd really love to hear from you. Now, General Ike, do you really think there's any possibility of bringing people together in the United States as an outsider? I mean, do you think it gives you any particular advantage in bringing people together?
Well, okay, so the phrase "bringing people together" is already, I think, a bit more presumptuous than I'd like. I don't. To have lost you for a moment.
Oh, we got you back.
You're back?
Yeah, we've got you back. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you're using the phrase in this sort of sense, but sort of allowing people to bring themselves together if they want to is maybe closer to it. but to drive to the point of your question, yeah, I think I have an advantage in that, like, I don't have a team as such. There's this fantastic joke about I think a guy who goes, the joke's told many ways, but I've heard it as a rabbi who's traveling through Ireland, and he goes for a drink in a bar, and as he's sipping his beer, he feels a heavy hand on his shoulder behind him, and a voice says in his ear, "Protestant or Catholic?" And the rabbi says, "Oh no, I'm Jewish." And the voice behind him says, "Aye, but Jewish Protestant or Jewish Catholic?" And the joke traditionally ends there, but you know, I'm hoping that that I can, by virtue of not being neither Protestant nor Catholic, so to speak, that I might be able to give an ear to both.
Right. So again, let me remind people, we'd love to hear from you on the call-in line. Please do give us a call if you're free and you'd like to ask a question to General Ike. But until we hear from someone, I'll continue to ask questions of General Ike. You talked about the division between Boston and Texas, but don't you think they're the same divisions inside Boston, inside Cambridge, Massachusetts? I mean, what if you were to talk to faculty at Harvard Law School and then talk to cafeteria workers at Harvard Law School? Don't you think you'd have the same kind of two worlds, or even more so, than talking to people in different parts of the country?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the short answer is yes. I think there's a little more to that. I have a friend who works in Austin, Texas, and he says that he and all his friends there are liberal, and they're he says that of all the people he knows, there are dozens of people there. He can't think of a single Republican voter, and this is in Texas. So I think that the sort of two Americas, if you want to think of it that way, they have a way of segregating themselves out, not just by like sort of big geographical features, but also within, and also the obvious class parallels take place. I think what the advantage of actually traveling with it is that you sort of have a different. The phrase "something in the water" springs to mind. It's that like if you go talk to people in Harvard who are going to have a sort of Harvard-oriented worldview, who are going to be living and breathing Harvard, and even if they're what would you say, batting for the opposition, they're still batting for the opposition from the starting premise of a Harvard-centered worldview. Whereas if you would go talk to someone in rural Texas, no matter how liberal they are, their starting position, in a sense, is rural Texas. Right. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, but as an American, of course, as an American, I'm not a neutral outsider, listening to everybody, but it is striking to me that everyone I hear about, all of the intellectuals I hear complaining about the divisions in America, two Americas, we can no longer talk to each other, are the people who used to do all the talking. So it's the Harvard, the Yale, the New York crowd, the Washington Post, the New York Times crowd. Those are the people who are upset about the new divisions in America. So there's some noise pollution on my side too here. Those are the people who are really upset about two Americas. I don't think a lot of people on Breitbart are upset about that. I think they're thrilled that there are finally two Americas, and that the discourse is not being monopolized by just one group. I mean, so is that two Americas and that tragedy of oh no, people aren't talking to each other, they've split in different camps? Is that a bad thing, or is that maybe what democracy is all about?
I don't presume to have the answers as to what democracy is all about, but I think that it can be fine if what's going on is people who previously didn't have anywhere to say anything they wanted to say now have somewhere to say something they want to say. I think what the problem is that to the extent that, I think my understanding of things is that it used to be a lot easier for you to be, say, you to be a Republican and to have Democrat voting friends, or the other way around. Now I read something, read a figure a while ago that the average American would be about twice as upset if their child came home and announced that they were dating someone who voted differently, as opposed to someone of different religious or racial origins.
Right.
And I think that's intense, right? Like the idea that even now, obviously these things are real issues, like the divisions along, I mean, maybe not in America as much religious lines, but certainly racial divisions are really powerful. And to think that political divisions are twice as powerful as that, I think that it can be healthy if like what it's giving people is a voice who might not otherwise have a voice. But I think to the extent that it means that Americans no longer think of themselves as in a sort of as one team trying to work out the differences, and think of themselves much more as, you know, two teams trying to fight it out for domination, that might be.
See, I might turn that around and say, but maybe it means that the two parties are finally standing for different things. And for a generation or two, the two parties didn't mean much. And so, you know, people didn't divide on party lines. They may still have divided on ideological lines, but the parties weren't representing those ideologies. And, you know, now that we see, you know, Republicans being Republicans and Democrats finally being Democrats, you know, maybe now as a result we are getting somewhere.
Maybe. I mean, like that could well. It's not. I don't sort of look at the situation. First of all, I don't look at the situation with a particularly well-trained eye in general. Like I'm not. I don't presume to be a scholar, but as you, for instance, are. But what it does seem to me that this is, even if it's not entirely a negative development. Oh, is my camera still up?
Yeah, we're having some problems with the video line. If you could just turn the camera back on, it should work. Mine went out as well. Thank you. Sorry about that. That's some technical problems we're having. The voice is coming through, though, loud and clear. Not a problem.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's I'm not. I don't mean to say that that every development along political lines right now is negative, and it could be. You know, if you want to be positive or optimistic about it, you could well say that people are actually, what would you say? Actually standing for different things, actually saying different things. But even if you want to take that perspective, even if you want to say that that's what's going on, there's still an importance that it's still important that after the two sides yell at each other about their differences, they're still able to sit down at a table or a coffee shop or a committee together and work together towards stuff. Because otherwise, we've got just chaos and bedlam.
Right. So we've got to wrap up in just a minute or two. Look, could you give us some details? I mean, do you have actual plans yet? Can people come meet you on your U.S. friendship tour? I'm sure that a lot of people who might be listening to this in the U.S. think, I'd love to meet General Ike. I'd love to talk to him for his podcast. You know, how can they do that?
Well, you can definitely come along. I should be a lot more prepared in terms of communication channels. Certainly, anyone who contacts you via your own channel and who wants to come along is very welcome to say hi if you're willing to. But in terms of the actual movements, the idea is around March next year to come up to the East Coast, start around Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts, that area, and then move down through New York, Washington, hopefully through Charlottesville, New Orleans, Texas, maybe Colorado, and then Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Francisco. and along the way in each of the major cities, try and have a few interviews, and then in the major cities have a few interviews, maybe more pre-planned, and then along the way try and stop in the towns and villages of rural America and have some more spontaneous interviews, maybe a few town halls, that sort of thing.
Great. And I've just put the name of the podcast, Building Jerusalem, up on the screen. General Ike, I'm sure if people just search the Building Jerusalem podcast, they'll easily find it.
Yeah, that's right. If you any podcast app like iTunes or whatnot, just on anything you should search it.
So you're on iTunes, Podbeam, all the usual podcast sites.
Yeah, I think that everyone these days just pulls off Apple or Stitcher. So,
okay.
Yeah. I think
all right,
so.
Great. General Ike, thanks for joining us on Midnight in America. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone out there watching and listening. Midnight in America is a little bit on hiatus right now because we worked through some technical problems, but I hope to be back soon and really going with a whole new roster of guests coming in May or June. Thanks a lot, everyone, for listening, and thank you, General Ike, for appearing on the show.
Thanks for having me, Salvatore.